Welcome back to our study of the book of Esther. We are in week 3, and we'll be looking at Esther chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. The search for a new queen. This is part of the Gospel Advocate Foundation's Adult Bible Study series, which they have a different book of the Bible or a different theme every quarter. And so we are moving right along, as I mentioned, into chapter 2. And we're approaching the holidays, of course. We'll have 2 more lessons after this one before the new year. So in this lesson, the search for a new queen, from the first half of chapter 2, the text has been divided into 3 sections by our author. And the first one is Young Women Summoned. This takes place in verses 1 through 4. We also get a little bit of a background on Ahasuerus, as we'll note in verse 1. And then we'll look at Esther's background in verses 5 through 7. And then we find out that Esther is pleasing to Haggai. He is the head eunuch. He's in charge of all the women that have a possibility of becoming queen. And he quickly notices Esther and places her in a place of really a place of advantage for her. So we will dive right into this. We will start with a little bit of a background here, an introduction for us for today. One of the verses noted in the booklet was Deuteronomy 7, verse 6. And really here, just pointing out that God is always with his people, and he will do what it takes to keep them physically alive. And then, of course, in the long run, he has done what is spiritually necessary through Christ to give us spiritual life. But here in Deuteronomy 7:6, we read, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth." It goes on to say it's not because they outnumbered other people or anything like that. It's because God chose them. And this really gives us a feel for the word holy. And of course, holy has a very deep, wonderful, fabulous meaning. But to be separated out, he chose the Jewish people. He chose the Israelites to be his people, and therefore they are set apart. They are not part anymore of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. They have been chosen out. They are holy, separate from all those other peoples. They are a people holy to the Lord your God, it says. So Esther is one of these people. Esther is one of the Jews, and she is going to be elevated to a position where she will have the ability to save her people. And I really like the way the booklet compared her role to Joseph's role. And we'll look at a few of those passages. Several are noted in the booklet, and really these are parallel in the sense that it doesn't look like good things are happening, but God has one of his people in the midst of the enemy, so to speak. And God's person continues to do amazing things and continues to succeed. It's a great lesson for us in this world. We are not where we belong either. Joseph was in captivity in Egypt. Esther was part of the captives taken to Babylonia. And then, of course, Persia defeats the Babylonians. So now it's the Persian Empire. But she is not where she belongs. She's not in her home. And she's able to do absolutely amazing things. And so we are called to do the same. We recognize that we are foreigners and exiles on this earth. This world is not our home, sometimes we sing. Our citizenship is in heaven. So let's take a look at a few of these Genesis passages. First, in Genesis 41, this is when Joseph, sorry. This is when Joseph first interprets the Pharaoh's dreams and actually gives a plan. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I've set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And then at the end of Genesis, at the end of the story, Joseph has succeeded. He has saved his family. They had come to get grain from the promised land down to what would be the promised land, down to Egypt, and they've been saved. And not only his personal family, but the Egyptians and many others from around the world who would come and need grain during this 7-year famine. And so at the end, Joseph's brothers, once their father passes away, they're a little bit worried that Joseph isn't going to be so kind now that dad is not around. But Joseph, he gives them very great wisdom in how they meant it to be evil, but God meant all these things that took place for good. So let's check that out. Genesis 50. Thus his sons did for him as he commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field at Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. All right, so let's move right into our text for today, Esther chapter 2. We'll be looking at verses 1 through 11. This first section is verses 1 through 4. The young women are summoned. And really, verse 1 is a little bit of a continuation of chapter 1, as you will see. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And so everything has calmed down. The feasts are over. Everything is probably back to normal now. And King Ahasuerus has calmed down. It's conjectured that maybe he regretted what he did. Maybe he really did love Vashti. We don't know. Probably the queen in these empire kind of situations was more of a figurehead rather than a wife. But he remembered her and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And so here we go. She's been removed from being queen, and a replacement needs to be found. So, verse 2. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa the citadel, under custody of Haggai. It sounds like the custody of a guy, but it's Haggai, the king's eunuch who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. And so, obviously, we don't understand some of these cultural things the way that we would if we lived back then. The idea of the queen being selected simply for beauty is something that's not really part of our culture in any way. Actually, we just don't have in the United States, we don't have kings to begin with, and we certainly don't have kings with hundreds of wives and hundreds of concubines. We don't have kings with a harem, as this is described. We don't get this at all, and we don't get the either the purposeful cruelty or just someone who was born a eunuch being in charge. This, of course, was because the eunuch would not have a sexual drive, and so the eunuch would not mess with the women in any way sexually. And so it was always eunuchs who worked with the king's harem so that they would not be sexually involved with any of the women. And so just a lot of things that are not the norm for us, of course. Now, it could be that part of this is just that a powerful king was expected to have a beautiful queen, whether or not they were married, whether or not, I mean, I'm sure there would have been a time of sexual encounter, you would imagine, between the king and the queen, and maybe the queen would be considered his favorite wife of all his wives and concubines, but not necessarily. It could be that someone was selected because of beauty, just as the palaces were beautiful, the gardens were beautiful, everything was expected to be perfect aesthetically, and including the queen of an empire such as this. And so they are bringing together all these young virgins, all these young women to Susa, the citadel. And in the end, King Ahasuerus will make the decision on who is going to be queen. All right, verses 5-7. We get a little bit of Esther's background here. Now, there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. And so we find out that Mordecai was part of he was part of the family that was taken away into Babylonian captivity. And so this was quite a bit back. Not a crazy amount of time, but probably 100 years at least. And so we have Mordecai, who ended up in now Susa, and had just stayed. When the Jews went back after the 70 years, not all of them went back, and people just had their lives set up. They stayed all around the empire, the Babylonian Empire, and now the Persian Empire. People would just stay where they were. Not everyone returned back to Jerusalem or back to Judah. So obviously Mordecai is one of the ones that stayed in the capital or the citadel here, now Susa. And he is from the tribe of Benjamin, which is the same tribe as the first king of Israel, King Saul. And I looked for various family trees, things that would help us to see the line of Benjamin down to Saul, and then down through Shimei, etc. Kish was the father of Saul, and so Mordecai comes from, he would be a cousin, maybe second, third, fourth, fifth cousin, but he would be a cousin of King Saul, of course, way down the line, so much, years and years later. But anyway, from the tribe of Benjamin, an important thing. And of course, Esther is as well, as we'll see in the next few verses. Okay, so verse 7. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle. So they are first cousins, it seems, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. And so part of the reason Mordecai probably stayed is because he was doing well. For him to be able to take someone in that was not his own and take care of her would imply a little bit of wealth, at least, to be able to bring up an extra person in your household. It's possible he was never married or had kids, but we're not told that. But anyway, Mordecai is able to take Esther in and take care of her, raise her, and be her the man of her household now, as he has taken her into his house. So we read that the young woman, this is Esther, had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And so we need to note that this is part of the reason she was able to be chosen, because of her beauty. Immediately, the eunuch in charge notices her, gives her, we'll read this in the next section, gives her 7 women from the palace to take care of her. So any of you women out there, if you ever go to get your nails done or get your eyebrows done or your hair done, anything like that, can you imagine 7 women working on you? Well, this is what takes place here. Esther has 7 women working on her for a year. And so, whatever all that means, she definitely was being taken care of. She was already beautiful, already lovely to look at, as we're told, and then gets all this help. And I think this is worth noting. There, just as there's no, in the church, there's no Jew nor Greek, there's no male nor female, there's no, we are all equal as children of God. But it doesn't take away the fact that some people have various gifts. And sometimes we view the gifts. Maybe someone has a gift for benevolence. Maybe someone has a gift of encouragement. Maybe someone is gifted and qualified to be an elder in the Lord's church. There are all sorts of different things. But there is a truth to beauty. And some have been blessed with looks that are just more pleasing to the average human being than other people. And that is okay. And there is no problem with that. And the Bible never hides that. We're told about good-looking men in the Bible. We're told about good-looking women in the Bible. And this is just part of life. Some people have been blessed or cursed, depending on their context and their situation, but beauty is something that's godly. And when we get to heaven, I think we'll be blown away by the beauty. We'll be amazed and awed by how important aesthetics really are. We've kind of lost some of that in our culture. People kind of naturally know when they see something in nature or see a person or see a building or even a roadway that is adorned with certain vegetation and various things. We kind of have a feel for what is beautiful and then what is not so pleasant to look at. And I believe that's part of being made in the image of God. I believe that's part of a God trait, so to speak. And when we leave this life, when we leave this fallen world where all that has been skewed and messed up to whatever extent, I think we'll be amazed in the next life at the sheer beauty of what we are seeing and hearing, what we are doing. I think beauty is very important to God. And again, it doesn't mean that he loves a beautiful, and he wouldn't view us as we view each other for sure, but he loves no matter what, but we're going to be linked in more closely when sin leaves us, when we are glorified in the next life. I think we'll get this. We'll get it in a way that we've never gotten it here on earth. We are very physically oriented here, and we will have the perfect view of beauty. And I think it'll be amazing. But the bottom line here, the text is telling us part of the reason why she is going to be chosen, because she has a beautiful figure and is lovely to look at. And so, very, very important in this story. She needs to be selected queen of Persia, of all things, for a young Jewish girl to attain. It is absolutely incredible. The booklet points out over and over again God's involvement in all this, and I think that's very important. We do see in the story of Joseph, and we see here in the story of Esther, we see in the story of Ruth, uh, these ways in which God is at work. We might say behind the scenes, because no like actual miracle. He didn't change her appearance so that she could become queen. She wasn't homely leading up to this point, and then all of a sudden she became, she was born beautiful, and Joseph was born a hard worker. And we do see miracles in the Joseph story as he is given the ability to interpret those dreams. But here, God kind of, like I said, behind the scenes, working things out for the good of his people. Okay, so verses 8 through 11. Esther pleases Haggai, and this is the eunuch that's in charge of the harem. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman, we switch from women to woman, we switch from just talking about the women in general to Esther. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. All right, so pretty awesome. So she won his favor, and so you would think it's not just a beauty pageant, but probably a little bit of charisma, a little bit of personality, a little bit of, what is pleasing to Haggai. And we don't know what that would all entail, but she had it. And he elevated her to a great place of status in this whole contest, if you will, but in this whole process of the choosing of the new queen. There are 2 more verses in our text, and this is interesting. You wonder if Mordecai might have known what might come down, what might happen. But anyway, verses 10 and 11. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. So there's verse 10. We'll talk about verse 10 for a second, and then do verse 11. But so Mordecai had commanded her. So did he know that there was a little bit of bias against the Jews? Did he know that there might be a little bit of trouble if people in the palace knew she was a Jew? Was he already hearing rumblings of bad things that might happen to the Jews? You just never know. But he felt it was not necessary, at the very least, and maybe detrimental for her to let it be known that she was a Jew. And then verse 11, we see Mordecai's care for her. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So really, really, uh, I feel like he's probably significantly older than her. You know how the family trees, sometimes first cousins can be even decades apart in age. I feel like Mordecai is more like an uncle to Esther, since he took her into his household to raise her, or to keep her. And all these women being chosen, are young, and so we figure Esther is probably somewhere between 16 and 20, something like that. I can't know for sure, but someone very young. And so I feel I have an uncle feeling for Mordecai as opposed to a first cousin kind of feel. But anyway, Mordecai cares very much about her, and he wants to know what's happening. And so really, really neat that we see his care for her in this way. So 3 applications again this week. Number 1, the story of Esther beautifully illustrates the providence of God at work. How else could one describe the ascension of a Jewish girl to the position of Queen of Persia at such a vital time? This hasn't happened yet in our text, but of course it's about to. It is important to notice how Esther consistently gained the favor of those she met. This was no doubt the product of her godly behavior and God's blessings. There is no substitute for upright behavior. As Christians, we will influence others for Christ only if we behave appropriately. And so Philippians 1:27 was the one noted in the booklet. I'll give you 28 as well. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. And then finishing out the first application, at the same time, we must not discount God's involvement in our efforts. And so Chad Ramsey, the writer of these booklets, he's noting that we will have influence if we're doing the right things, if we behave appropriately. And at the same time, we need to realize that God is involved in all this. God is involved in giving us motivation and encouragement and strength, all the things that we need in Jesus Christ. And so 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6, I'll read 5 through 9. What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. And then verse 6, the one that is being stressed here, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. Again, God's involvement, God's work. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. Very, very cool. All right, application 2. The story of Esther illustrates the importance of doing what God commands. Had King Saul obeyed the command of the Lord and destroyed the Amalekites when so ordered, 1 Samuel 15:3, his relative Mordecai would not have had to withstand the wicked Haman. Haman was from that line, the Amalekites. It is not enough to know the will of God. We must obey his will completely. James put it simply. Be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. So as the application said, it's not enough to know the will of God. We've got to do it. We've got to be engaged with it. We have to be active in it. Jesus said the same thing. Those of you who hear these words of mine and put them into practice, you're like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And troubles come, but the house stands firm. And if you hear these words of mine and do not do them, you're like a foolish man who builds his house upon the sand. The storms come, the wind blows, the rain comes, and the house falls flat, we'll say. So we need to be doers of the word and not hearers only. If we're hearers only, we're just deceiving ourselves, as James tells us. And then the third application, Esther's story helps us see that God can bring good out of bad situations. There is no excuse for the sexually immoral behavior of King Ahasuerus. Nevertheless, God used the king's poor decisions to bring about a good result. We likewise have no record of Esther complaining about her lot. Instead, she made the most of the situation in which she found herself. It is important to recognize that God uses prepared people to accomplish his will. Very, very good. And God will. He will work his will. We need to be ready. We need to be prepared. We need to be looking for opportunities to do good and to do God's bidding. All right. With this lesson, there are 4 discussion questions, and I encourage you to pause the video and think about these things. If you're watching this with someone else, you can discuss them one by one, or you can just let the recording roll and think about them briefly as we go through them. Number 1, why do you think the text emphasizes the genealogy of Mordecai? What lesson or lessons can we learn from this? Number 2, why do you think Mordecai instructed Esther to conceal her ethnicity? Number 3, how is Esther's situation similar to the one Joseph found himself in while in Egypt? And number 4, what does this section teach us about God's providence? Lots of great things to think about there. Next week, we will look at the rest of chapter 2. We'll look at Esther 2, 12 to 23. And the title for this one is Prepared for Presentation. So we've had a little taste of the fact that Esther was receiving cosmetics, receiving certain foods, and this is going to go on for a whole year, this preparation. And so then she and other candidates will be presented, and of course we know, spoiler alert, Esther is chosen as the queen. Well, may the Lord continue to bless us as we study his word.